So good evening, welcome. Thank you, each of you and all of you for coming out tonight. I'm Juanita Ryan, and I am part of the Creation Care team here and the Refuge team, and we also have a racial justice team. Those are our three justice groups that are hard at work here and are really the sponsor of this evening. And tonight what we want to do is talk about working for justice grounded in love. We want to talk about what in the world that means and how to do that. So I want to give you a little idea of what the evening's going to look like. I'm going to sort of in two parts. I'm going to start by talking a bit about grounding ourselves in God's love, both the invitation to do that from Scripture and the barriers that we often face in doing that. And then I'm going to give us some time to do a little personal reflection that you don't need to share in small group if you don't want to later on, but it's sort of for your own personal reflection time with a couple questions. And then the second half will be about grounding our justice work in God's love. So when we're doing justice work, we're doing the work of, in part, of bearing witness to a lot of suffering in this world. And in bearing witness, we run a very high risk of experiencing vicarious trauma and grief and anger and burnout. So we'll talk about those four realities and how to keep coming back to that place of grounding in our own bodies and grounding God's love so that we can continue working from that place of love. So I like to start by breathing. For me, I like to do that. For all of us, perhaps. For me, it helps to put my hand on my heart and to nothing fancy with your breath, but simply let yourself feel and notice the breath going in to your body. And as you feel your breath moving into your body, let yourself just come back home to your body. Home to right here where God is with us. And I'd like to open in prayer. God, thank you that you call us to this work that is so much bigger than anything we can do. Thank you that this work is your work that we're invited to be participants in. We ask that you would really speak to us tonight, that your Spirit would be here offering us gifts of healing and hope and love and joy. Thank you in your name. Amen. So we want to start by talking about grounding ourselves in God's love. What are the invitations and the barriers? It seems like it should be an easy and obvious thing to do, but it turns out that it's often not quite so easy. But let's start with this wonderful prayer from Ephesians 3:14 through 19. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. I pray that according to the riches of God's glory, God may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being through the power of his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. So, wow. It's so incredible. We are so incredibly loved by God, with a love that is beyond our comprehension and obviously beyond this author's words to even describe or speak of. And yet this prayer is that our inner being would be strengthened to be able to really take in that love. I love the imagery of rooted, being rooted and grounded, this idea of this vast, rich soil of God's love, of being able to just sink our roots into that rich, verdant soil of love and be nurtured by it. If you sort of playing with that image, one of the images that comes to me is this idea of each of us being seeds. And we've been planted into this wonderful soil of God's love that's holding us and nurturing us. And for some of us, our outer shell is fairly porous. And that porous shell kind of falls away, and our roots are able to begin to sink deeply into that soil so that the shoots can emerge. But for many of us, our shells have been hardened by needing to protect that really tender inner self of ours. So this reality that seems like it should be so easy to just sink ourselves into this incredible love, this safe and powerful, tender love of God, turns out not to be so easy for all of us, probably for most of us. I know it has not been easy for me. I know that I have had trouble really knowing that God loves me in a way that is in that way of just sinking into that love. So it's possible that in spite of living in a world that is full of the love and grace of God, we can find ourselves starving for love. That's a quote from Dale Ryan from an article called Recovery from Spiritual Anorexia. It's like we're seeds in that soil where there's all this richness, all this nurture, and we can't fully take it in. Like living in a world that's full of the love and grace of God and not being able, and starving for God's love. So the question is, how do we understand this? How do we understand what the dynamics are at play? How we might work with this barrier, this challenge? One of the ways I think about it is from a really simple model that I want to share with you. So this model basically says that that inner being that is being addressed and prayed for in that prayer is this part of us, I would call it our true self or our spirit, this part of us that's created in love to love and be loved. This is the most tender part of us, the most spontaneously loving, joyful, creative part of us. One of the images that come to mind is like a little 3-year-old kid who might see you, know you, love you, and come running up and grab your leg because they're so excited that you're there, and be unabashedly ashamed about wanting a hug back. That's this part of us. But what happens is that we are all, most of us, but I would say all of us, have some kind of woundedness and carry fear and shame. And tragically, some of that fear and shame can be that actually we do not believe that we are loved. We actually don't believe we're capable of loving. The very essence of who God made us to be is often called into questions because of our fear and shame. And this fear and shame can show up in 1,000 different ways. It can be like we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're not religious enough, we don't, right? 1,000 different kinds of fears. It might be fears that others and God are disappointed in us or easily angered with us, or the experience that if people really knew us, they would run the other way if we really allowed people to know who you are. And there's often shame for the longing to love and be loved. That itself can feel shameful when that need has not been adequately met in our life. So what happens is, in the same time that the fear and shame is developing, we develop protective strategies, ways of defending ourselves, because this all feels so painful and vulnerable. And we do this without attending to or consciously aware that we're even doing it. And that again, the defenses can be many. Most of us have many kinds of defenses, but there can be a whole long list of ways we can defend ourselves. Perfectionism, never doing enough, working harder and harder and harder, right? Or people-pleasing, or giving up and despairing, becoming cynical or skeptical. There's so many ways that we can defend ourselves and protect ourselves. When I was in my early 20s, I was newly married, and I was beginning to realize that something wasn't right. was beginning to dawn on me. I had no sense of how shut down I was. I had no sense of the fear and shame I was carrying, but I did have a sense that I was having trouble trusting that Dale loved me, my new husband, even though I saw plenty of evidence that he did. And I began to realize that I had this same dynamic going on with God, that I was having trouble believing and trusting God's love. I was a missionary kid. I was raised in the faith. I believed in a God of love, but I was realizing that I was really not really able to sink those roots deep into that wonderful soil. So I tried really hard to fix this problem. For years, probably for a good decade, I tried really hard to read the right books, to pray the right prayers, to read more scripture, to change myself. And I came to the place where I realized that I was powerless over this. Whatever was amiss with me, I was not able to fix myself. The way that Thomas Merton talks about the healing we need is quite delightful to me. We must cast off our false exterior self, like the cheap and showy garment that it is. We must find our real self. And its very great and very simple dignity, created to be the child of God, and capable of loving with something of God's own sincerity. I love the image of throwing off the exterior self as a cheap and showy garment. I love the idea that who we really are is this child of God's self, that tender, vulnerable inner being that we were just talking about. But it turns out that just throwing that exterior self off is not so easy. Those defenses are there for a reason. And the fear and shame came out of wounds that we may not even know or have awareness of. So the question is, what practices might be powerful enough to break through our defenses and fear and shame and open our hearts to receive love and to offer love to others? What might be powerful enough? So I'm just going to share with you 3 general categories of things that helped me. And they're sort of broad categories. So the first thing that I realized I needed to do is to get honest. I needed to begin to allow myself to know and to talk to God about and to share with a few other people all of this, that I was struggling with this problem of not being able to trust the love that was being offered to me, whether it was in my marriage or in friendships or from God. I needed to talk about those defenses and what they were and about the fear and shame underneath them. And I needed also to talk about the longing for love and to be loved that I was just beginning to really feel. So honesty was a really important starting point, and that in itself is not just throwing off a garment. It's hard work, and it has to be repeated, and you really need people that are safe to be able to do that with. But one of the ways I did this was I began to journal almost every day. And the journaling I did is a prayer, so I at least felt like I was talking to God about all this. Excuse me. And in the journaling, I would just write whatever was going on with me without editing, just so I could know what was stirring inside, and so I could turn that into a prayer and offer it to God. So honesty about our fears and shame and defensiveness and our longing to love can remind us that everyone experiences these dynamics. We're all defended. We're all struggling with shame and fear. We all long for love and belonging, and knowing this can help us interact with greater humility and kindness toward all. Mary's bringing me some water. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, let's see if that does the trick. Thank you, Mary. So it's important as we think about doing this work ourselves that this work ultimately will impact our relationships, and it will certainly impact our justice work, because it gives us a whole different perspective of what people are dealing with. that everybody, there are basically a whole lot of walking wounded in this world, and that everybody is struggling with something. And it just really helps to remember to look past the surface of all the screaming and yelling and fighting, and remember that. So another really important thing was a kind of humility that is self-compassion. So I call it humility because this kind of honesty takes a certain level of humility to say, I too struggle with being defended and shut down or reactive. I too struggle with fear and shame. I'm just coming to understand. And I too long to know what it is to be free to fully love and be loved. But the self-compassion part, it sounds really weird to most of us because we haven't been taught to do self-compassion, and it can even sound wrong. But self-compassion is a really important, intentional way of taking in God's compassion for us and taking in the compassion of others and extending that compassion to ourselves. So what does that even mean? If we think about what is it to be compassionate with another person, what we're really talking about is sitting with somebody in their pain, sitting with deep respect, sitting with great patience, sitting without agenda, which is not as easy to do as one might think, because we are just really itching to help and fix and take pain away. But compassion is not an attempt to take pain away. It's an attempt to share it. So when we sit with somebody in compassion, we sit with them right where they are. When we sit with ourselves in compassion, we're not shaming ourselves for what we're feeling. We're not trying to change ourselves and what's going on. We're sitting with that kind of kindness towards ourselves, that patience towards ourselves, paying attention to what's going on with kindness and love. And what happens is that compassion is what heals us. Compassion is what changes us. Love and compassion are ultimately what heals and changes us. So self-compassion is a really important way of being able to get freed up a little bit to let those roots sink deep into that love. And the more we practice this kind of compassion, humility towards ourselves, the more we will extend compassion to others. I was always a compassionate person, but I think the depth of that compassion really increased the more I learned to extend that kind of compassion to myself. And the more we do this, the more grounded we will be in God's love and kindness toward us and towards all. And again, this is really important in our justice work. So a third thing that I had to do was just directly seek God's healing. I had come to that place of knowing that I was powerless over what was going on inside of me and that I needed God's help. So things that were helpful to me in seeking God's healing, the 12-step spirituality has been enormously helpful to me. Centering prayer has been enormously helpful to me. And Lectio Divina has been really helpful. And I also began to do a practice of something I called listening prayer, where I would do that journal writing, that honest journal writing as a prayer. And then I would just sit and invite God to show me whatever God wanted to show me. And sometimes it was just really quiet, and I would just commit to paying attention all day to whatever God might be showing me. Sometimes I would have experiences with God. And there was one such day when I was sitting in that kind of prayer, when I was grieving, actively grieving, and my heart was breaking. And I had this sense of God inviting me to hand my heart to God, which I thought was weird, but I was crying, it was fine, I wouldn't do anything. So of course my thought was, I'm going to hand my heart to God, and God is going to mend my breaking heart. He's going to hold it together at least. But the image that came as I imagined myself literally handing my physical heart to God, because it was a physical heart that was hurting, was that God took my heart and broke it all the way open, like through the defenses and through the shame and fear to that inner being. And like a loaf of bread. So at the same time that I began to see this, I was also kind of seeing Jesus taking the loaves from the child and breaking them open to feed a hungry crowd. And thinking that this is what happens when our hearts break open, when God breaks us all the way open, so our tender self is there, is that we are able to feed people starving for love. So, when we're working for justice and it leaves us feeling overwhelmed and inadequate, we can let ourselves be that kid. Only has a little bit to share in face of overwhelming need. We can remember that it is God who will feed the hungry crowd. God who is at work to heal and restore and make things right. God who will make a way when there is no way. So I'm going to have you respond to a couple questions from personal reflection first, but I would like to breathe again together. So if you would indulge me, you don't have to put your hand on your heart, but just to take a minute to feel the breath moving into your body again. And out. Just feel the flow of that breath. And this time kind of let it be the prayer, the breath prayer of letting yourself come home to your body. Home to your body where God dwells with you. Okay, so I just want to give you a few minutes. I think if you don't have paper and pen, Mary was going to find them for you, to just take maybe 5 minutes to write about some of the things you say to yourself in self-judgment. Just whatever comes to your mind about that. What are the ways that you judge yourself or say unkind things to yourself? And what loving words might God be saying to you tonight? So write a brief letter of compassion from God to yourself, beginning with the term of endearment, and write whatever comes, like my dear beloved child, or whatever term of endearment you want to use. So taking a moment to invite the Spirit to guide you, and just respond to these questions as much as you can and want. We're not going to take these questions into discussion. Give you 5 minutes and we'll come back and do part 2. All right, I hope that was a useful exercise for you, something that you can keep doing, something I do on a regular basis, actually. So, part 2, let's talk about what it means to ground our justice work in God's love. So again, we're going to look at the things that we're very likely to run into in doing this work, which is vicarious trauma, which we'll talk about what that even is, and grief, and anger, and burnout. So we're going to look at each of those and look at how we can care for ourselves and others in this process, and also really be cared for and shepherded by God in this work. So when we're talking about vicarious trauma, what we're talking about is bearing witness to other people's trauma, not experiencing it directly ourselves. But what happens in vicarious trauma is that as we bear witness to somebody else's trauma, we experience much of what they're experiencing, but in a milder form, obviously much milder. But that feeling of horror and shock and outrage and heartbreak, we experience those. And probably, at least I would say for myself, I experience the whole gamut of that run through me every time there's another shooting. But then we kind of shut it down rather quickly because there's only so much you can bear. But that also happens to the victims. So what happens when you're experiencing trauma is you have that strong reaction of horror and shock and outrage, and then you go numb. And then you kind of are disconnected from your body and even your brain, your ability to think, and you become really agitated. So with vicarious trauma, that can also happen to people who are experiencing it vicariously. Even though we shut it down, as part of what happens is that then we end up in this place of numbness and this place of being agitated and looking for some way to change that agitation, right? We get restless. So a description of vicarious trauma from Habakkuk 1. This is a text that Scott knows well. We did a whole video series on this. God, how long do I have to cry out for help before you listen? How many times do I have to yell, help, murder, police, before you come to the rescue? Why do you force me to look at evil, stare trouble in the face day after day? Anarchy and violence break out, quarrels and fights all over the place. Law and order falls to pieces, justice is a joke. The wicked have the righteous hamstrung and stand justice on its head. It's an incredibly powerful description of the experience of vicarious trauma, of witnessing violence, right? And quarrels and fights and the disintegration of law and order. So what do we do when this is our experience in working for justice? And it will be. What I would say is it really helps to pray honestly. And I would use that prayer in Habakkuk over and over again. There's also incredibly powerful prayers in the Psalms that echo this kind of heart cry. And one of the reasons it's helpful to do this is that we want to take our shock and our outrage and our heart cry directly to God, because we are wondering, where are you, God? So we need to take it directly to God. And we need to speak it out because it helps us from going completely numb and from completely disconnecting from ourselves as we bear witness. And then I would say breathing practices, like what we've just been doing. So a couple things about breathing. They're universally used, right, around the world as ways of bringing us back into our bodies, of calming us, of keeping us literally grounded, of bringing healing. So breathing practices do all of those things. They also are a reminder to us that every breath is a gift from God, that this breath is sacred, is holy as we breathe. Doing 1-minute breathing breaks throughout the day can really help with this kind of process. And then there's a self-compassion breath prayer that I think is really helpful, which is saying as we breathe, this is hard. Because we're doing everything we can to run from that sentence. We want to make that not true, but it is so true. So we hear about another shooting. This is so hard. Can you feel it in your body? So I want you to try it with me. So hand on heart and just let yourself say, this is hard. This is hard. So it brings us back into a place of what's real without completely falling apart, right? Holding ourselves, literally. You probably all heard the last 5 years about the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve in our body runs from our brain through our throat, into our heart, and into our gut. We're literally holding our vagus nerve and calming it when we do this. Then I think another thing in terms of vicarious trauma is taking meaningful action. It really helps to actually take some action. So call a representative, sign petitions, join a march, find ways to actually connect with other people in community like we have here in the justice teams, to take action in our own community and beyond. It can make a big difference in helping us move through vicarious trauma, that we're not alone in this, and that there are at least ways that we can speak up. One of the things about speaking up in the face of bearing witness to trauma is that The direct victims usually don't have a choice or a voice. It's part of what it means to be a victim. But when we're experiencing vicarious trauma, we do have a voice and we do have a choice and we can stand up. And doing so makes a difference to us and hopefully to outcomes. So when we do the work of staying somewhat grounded in vicarious trauma, we are going to feel grief and we are going to feel anger. And we certainly are going to feel them initially when we first are exposed to yet more violence, yet more injustice. We do not like grief. It makes our bodies hurt. It makes our hearts hurt, our bodies go heavy, we can't think, we can't function properly. We think we should snap out of it. And not a lot of support for grieving in our culture. So it's really hard for us to stay with it. But it is really important to make room for it. So I think part of what we don't realize is that it's like carrying a really heavy reservoir of water that literally needs to go downstream, that literally needs to be released. And when we release that sorrow, and whether it's with tears or not, but just sitting with the sorrow and letting ourselves feel that heaviness, it begins to get released from our body. So there was an environmental activist decades ago, Joanna Macy, who talked about it this way, that our difficulty and looking at what we are doing in our worlds, to our world, stems not from callous indifference or ignorance, so much as our fear of pain. We are called to not run from outrage and grief. So if we can be with our pain, to be with it until it turns. And as it turns, to reveal its other face. And the other face of our pain for the world is our love for the world. Our absolutely inseparable connectedness with all of life. Our grief, all of our grief, for somebody that we've lost, or for what's being done to our world, or the injustices we're watching, all of it is our love. All of it is our love. So it is precious. So in Jeremiah 9, the Lord calls for help for his people to grieve. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Call for the wailing women to come. Because they had professional wailers in those days. Probably need them still. Send for the most skillful of them. Let them come quickly and wail over us till our eyes overflow with tears and water streams from our eyelids. In response to injustice, this is the call of the Lord, for us to find ways to lament together, to have liturgies of lament. Because it heals us and it frees us to take actions that are healing in this world. It connects us with our love, because our grief is our love. So then there's anger. So anger we don't dislike quite so much, but there's a lot of prohibitions around anger in our culture, but especially in our Christian culture. That we're supposed to be not so angry, right? We're supposed to be kind of, nice and forgiving. So this is the translation in the Message of Ephesians 4:26, the one that we usually read, do not be angry. Don't let your sun go down in the anger. So this is the way it reads, I think is really helpful. Go ahead and be angry. You do well to be angry, but don't use your anger as fuel for revenge. So anger is an emotion that comes with permission and a warning, and I think we need to pay attention to both. So anger is that energy in our bodies. So first of all, justice work often means challenging the powers that be, which is what's going to stir up our anger, because we're going to feel so powerless. We live in a world where the rich are powerful and where greed seems to win. It's the same world Jesus lived in. It's easy to find ourselves angry not only with unjust systems, but with the people who profit from them and support them. But this anger is actually vital. It's connected to our love as well. Anger can be a kind of energy that signals that something's wrong, that something needs to change, and we need to let our outrage help us speak up. We need to let it help us take action. But this comes with a caveat. but not sin is the way one of the translations say it. We need to be angry. We need to let that energy come up in us and let it help us love what is being harmed and take action. But we do not want to let it take us to a place of hating haters. We don't want to let it take us to a place which is such an easy slippery slope to self-righteousness. I think one of the constant temptations of justice work is self-righteousness. We're on the right side, the other people are on the wrong side. We're doing it the right way, they're doing it all wrong. What's wrong with them? What's the problem with them? We want to mock, we want to dismiss, we want to belittle, we want to hate. And we cannot do justice work from that place. It's no longer justice work. We're now just part of the same problem. We have to do this work from a place of love. So let's listen to Jesus. To you who are ready for the truth, I say this. This is Jesus speaking. Love your enemies. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the subtle moves of prayer for that person. No more payback. Live generously. I tell you, love your enemies. Help and give without expecting a return. You'll never, I promise, regret it. Live out this God-created identity the way our Father lives towards us, generously and graciously, even when we are at our worst. Our Father is kind. You be kind. These are such powerful words. So when we think about how in the world do we do this, I would say that 12-step spirituality has really been helpful with this. They just take this seriously. They take resentment and revenge and hate really seriously, do amazing work in that process of 12 steps. But specifically around this kind of anger, they say, if there's somebody you identify as an enemy, do what Jesus said, pray for them. And don't just pray for them once, pray for them every single day for 6 weeks. That's the assignment. Every single day for 6 weeks. Can you think of anybody off the top of your head you see on TV that you maybe kind of don't like? Maybe kind of might identify as an enemy? Pray for them every day for 6 weeks. See what happens. It changes us. It changes us. It gives us different eyes, a different heart. So I think we need to take this really seriously in our justice work. And then there's burnout, which we're always at risk at in this work. So burnout is that experience of just being so overwhelmed and so depleted that we can't really go on. And hopefully we can catch burnout before it gets to that point. So let's listen to Jesus again. Matthew 11. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burnt out on religion, on justice work, on doing good? Come to me. Get away with me. You'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me. Work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. I could read this every single day. It is so helpful. It's such an incredible map or roadway to sanity for me. Come away with me. I'll show you how to take a real rest. And it's from that place then that we walk and we work with Jesus. Not that he works with us, but that we work with him because this is his work. So that's the first thing we need to do in terms of burnout. We need to remember that this work is way bigger than us. We're a tiny little part of a very big process This is God's work. It is God's long work of redemption in this world. So God is always at work to heal and restore and make all things new. This is God's work that we are called to join. We do this work because it is God's work, what God calls us to do, not because we are in charge of an outcome. That's a really huge one. We are not in charge of outcomes. But because it reflects the loving heart of God, we do this work. Because it's an expression of who we are, because it reflects God's love for all. So this is God's work, not ours. We're just a small part of it, which means we can rest. This burden is not ours that we're carrying. So we also need to practice self-care, which is really a spiritual practice. It's not only a practice based in honesty and humility about our creaturely needs, it's a practice of treating ourselves as the loved and valued children of God that we are. It's a practice that grounds us and strengthens us to treat all others as the loved and valuable children that they are. When we're talking about self-care, we're not so much talking about champagne and bubble baths. We're talking about really basic, taking care of our physiological, emotional, spiritual needs. We're talking about getting rest at night. We're talking about maybe taking naps. We're talking about eating reasonably, exercising, getting outside. Basic self-care for our creaturely needs. That's what we're talking about. And they can get ignored when we get caught up in doing this kind of work. Really important to make them a priority, always in life. And then the other thing I would say about preventing burnout is to love and serve in community. Do this together. Remember that we are all loved by God in community. Remember who God is and who we are and who all others are in community. We can bear to let our hearts break open in grief in community. We gather to pray in community. We can take bold action in community, and we can know the joy of loving and serving and acting out of our best selves together in community. And so one of the things we want to also say here is that you are invited to join the justice groups in some form or another here at CPC. So there's email lists that you can get on, and if you're on an email list, it's not committing to anything other than getting occasional emails about some way to learn or pray or act about the concerns that that justice group is working on. And you can find these all on the website at CPC. Some of the groups are really interested in input about ideas and maybe even potentially joining leadership groups. So come and join us in community to do this work together. All right, so one more time with the breath. All right, coming back to our bodies. Back to our bodies where God dwells, acknowledging this is hard. It's hard work. I want to give you some time to do a little thinking and writing about what helps you when you feel overwhelmed and angry, and what self-care practices are helpful to you. So I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes to do that, and then we will just form a small group here, all of us, and talk about this part or anything else you want to talk about from this evening. Thank you.